If you're thinking about hiking the Vermont Long Trail, then this video is for you. Let's go. My son and I completed all 270 plus miles of the Long Trail, but that thing completely and thoroughly kicked our butts. We learned so much valuable information on that hike, and I'm here to share with you today some of the equipment and food changes we would make going forward, some of the challenges we faced, and at the very end, I'll talk about whether or not I would hike the Long Trail again. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I have a standard gear list that I take on pretty much all of my hikes, but from time to time I have to make adjustments based on the specific needs of a certain trail. And the Long Trail is one of those. First off, I'm going to talk about camp shoes. So camp shoes is something I do not normally take with me on a hike. I think it's a luxury item that is nice to have, but not something where I want to carry the extra bulk or weight. The Long Trail, I consider camp shoes to be an absolute necessity, mandatory equipment. I didn't bring any with me, and I was miserable the first couple of days walking around with completely soaking wet feet. Your feet are going to be wet almost every day, and being able to take off your shoes, put on those camp shoes, and let your feet air out is fantastic. The first thing I did on the first town stop we took is I ran straight to the store and bought myself some knockoff Crocs, and I was so glad that I did. One of the reasons I like Crocs better is because there's a covering over your feet. And when you're at camp in the evening and you're going to get water or you got to go to the privy, the trails to those things are often very rocky and slippery and a little bit treacherous. So you could easily slip, and if you're wearing flip-flops, you could gash your foot open, and you certainly wouldn't want to do that. Next is sunglasses. I think this is a piece of mandatory gear on just about every trail, but not on the Long Trail. My sunglasses just sat in my hip pocket of my pack the whole time because it's pretty much a green tunnel from end to end, and you get a view here and there, but for the most part there's really no need for sunglasses. The problem I ran into is with all of the rubbing in my pack all day long, my sunglasses got ruined because the lenses got all scratched up. So if you do bring sunglasses, I would suggest bringing some kind of a protective case to put them in so they don't get damaged when they're in your pack like what happened to me. But overall, not a piece of gear I would bring on the Long Trail, although it's something I would never hike without on most any other trail. Next, I'll talk about rain gear. So I've been using Frog Togs for pretty much as long as I've been backpacking, and they've served me pretty well. However, on the Long Trail, it rains so often and so heavy and so long that I completely wetted out in my Frog Togs top several times, and that left me a little bit wet, cold, and miserable. Now I get that most rain gear is probably going to wet out if you're in that much rain, but the other issue with the Frog Togs is they're a little bit on the flimsy side, and I was climbing over so many rocks and going under and over down trees. I was getting snags and holes in them, so they didn't really hold up that well on this trip. My thought is if you've considered upgrading your Frog Togs to some nicer rain gear, this trip might be the excuse to do that. Me personally, I would love to have something like the Enlightened Equipment Visp, although at $200, it's something I haven't invested in at this point so far. But this would be a great time to upgrade that rain gear because the Frog Togs, although you can get by with them, they probably aren't going to be in the best of shape by the time you get done with your hike. The next gear change that's specific to the Long Trail is taking a third pair of socks. I normally hike with just two pair, one to wear and then one to wash and let dry. However, with the Long Trail being so wet and muddy all the time, my feet were always soaked, and I brought an extra pair of socks so I could wear dry ones in the evening, and I'm so glad that I did. That third pair of socks never got wet. I just kept it in my pack until the evening. I'd put it on when I was going to bed, and oh, it felt so good to put my feet in nice, warm, dry socks after they were so wet all day long. So having a third pair of socks I think would be a great idea for the Long Trail, even though you might normally only carry two. That covers the equipment adjustments. I want to talk about two minor menu adjustments that I would make if I was doing this trail again. One is I would pack extra food. Normally I feel like I pack too much food, but on this trail, I think it was because of all of the uphill and downhill and expending a lot of extra energy with all that climbing, I was going through food at a much higher rate than I normally would. In the last week or so of the hike, I was blowing through my breakfast and morning snacks and even part of my lunch by 9 in the morning. And I had to really have some discipline to not just eat all of the food in my pack because I was getting so hungry. Now that normally doesn't happen for me, but I think I was running such a huge calorie deficit that my typical 4,000 calorie a day menu was just simply not enough for what I was burning on the long trail. So you can make adjustments as you get to town, and as you do your resupplies, your body will tell you what you need, and you can add a little bit more if you need to. But my thought is you may need a bit more food than what you're used to on the long trail. The second menu item is around electrolytes. Now, because of the heat and the humidity, we were going through a lot of water. We were sweating like crazy, and I've never been through that much water as I was going through on the long trail. Water on the long trail is plentiful, but when you're drinking a lot of it and you're sweating a lot, you're going through a lot of salt and electrolytes, and you need to replenish those. Electrolytes help with your energy, with your mood, with your just ability to keep hiking throughout the day. So you got to keep those electrolytes up even more so than you would on a normal trail. Bottom line here, have more electrolytes than what you normally do handy because you're probably going to need them. I like Noon. I like Liquid IV. Those are two that I use quite often and have had success with them. One more equipment related thing I did differently on a long trail was to not use the straps on my trekking poles. Normally I like to use the straps because they help me power up a hill, that kind of thing. However, I was getting my poles snagged in rocks and roots probably like 50 times a day. And a lot of times you'd slip and your pole would get snagged in there. So by not using the straps, when that happened, I could let the poles go and they'd fall harmlessly to the ground. Whereas if my wrists were in there, you'd slide and your pole would be stuck and you'd just snap that thing. The long trail eats trekking poles for breakfast. And I think by not using your wrist straps, you can help keep your trekking poles intact. Next up, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that we faced on the long trail that were maybe a bit different than what we've normally seen while out backpacking. And you may think this sounds a little bit like a list of complaints, and maybe it is a little bit, but for the most part, I want you to understand what the unique challenges are on the long trail so you can be mentally prepared to deal with those things. The first challenge is mud, and I completely expected to see mud. I was familiar with the term Vermud, referring to Vermont before we went out on the trail, but I was not prepared for the mud fest that was mile after mile after mile on the trail. And people had said, oh, don't worry about it. It gets a lot better past Rutland. Well, that was fake news because although it was a little bit less in the northern part of the state, there was mud from end to end. It wasn't all day, every day, but there was a lot of mud. And when you're walking through that ankle deep slop, it can really, really get to you after a while. So my thought is just be prepared for mud from the day you start to the day you're finished, and don't be hoping that it's gonna stop at some point because it really doesn't. And if you keep that in mind, it'll help you be a lot more mentally prepared for dealing with the mud. The next challenge was water on the trail. And I don't mean drinking water, I mean the trail literally was running water. There was a lot of this in the first part of the hike. I would estimate in maybe the first 50 or so miles of the trail, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the trail was literally running water. Like it was a stream that you were walking on. I couldn't believe how much of the trail was running water. And maybe it was because there was a ridiculous amount of rain at the time we went, but so much the trail was running water. And the issue with that is it makes the rocks very slippery, and then your feet get completely soaked. There's no way to keep your feet dry if you're gonna stay walking on the trail. And that was a real challenge. So similar to the mud, just keep that in mind that you're gonna see a lot of running water in the trail, especially if it's a rainy part of the year. And if you're prepared to deal with that, it will help you a lot with the mental aspect of hiking the long trail. Next up, I wanna talk a little bit about the terrain. So no doubt you've heard that the terrain on the long trail can be quite challenging. That's what it's known for. However, this is another one of those things where I had read about it, but I was not prepared at all for how challenging it was. If you watched my videos, you saw areas where we were going up and down ladders and up and down rungs and even a rope at one point that we had to climb down. And that stuff was awesome. That was fun. That was totally enjoyable. And it was one of the best parts of the whole experience was doing that very unique terrain. However, the difficult parts of walking straight up and down wet, slippery rocks, wet, slippery roots, and just steep declines where we're slipping and almost falling all the time, it was very difficult, and it just weighed on us pretty heavily because you just don't get any break from it. It seems like you're just always going straight up or straight down, and it was quite a challenge. So just be prepared for how rugged this trail really is. There are very few sections where it's like your typical packed dirt kind of trail where you just walk along and enjoy the scenery around you. You're climbing over stuff and down stuff pretty much all the time. Again, I'm sharing this stuff with you about the ruggedness of the terrain just so you're prepared for it when you get out there. Related to the difficulty of the terrain is the overall danger factor. The danger factor on the long trail is what I would consider pretty high for hiking trails. I was slipping and falling quite a bit. Now, if you're backpacking, you're going to slip and fall from time to time. It's really unavoidable. But over the 25 days we were on the trail, we were trying to count, and I estimate somewhere between 10 and 15 times I had complete and total wipeouts, feet in the air, tumbling down the trail. And Callan had quite a few himself as well. Now, I avoided serious injury because I was pretty lucky, but I had a bad bruise on my hip. I hit my arm really hard on a rock and probably came pretty close to breaking it at one point. And I had tons of scratches and bruises and scrapes. I wasn't really expecting to fall that many times at all, but it's so slippery and so steep and it's quite dangerous. I didn't meet anybody that said they hadn't fallen while they were out on that trail. So expect to wipe out. And one thing you could do is check your first aid kit. Make sure you've got like Neosporin and extra Band-Aids in there because more than likely you're gonna need that stuff. The next challenge is the weather. Now, we thought the weather was terrible when we were there, and then we were talking to some people who had hiked it a few weeks before us, and apparently it was even worse. Let me just say it rains in Vermont. A lot. Heavy rain for hours and hours. And if you watch my video series, you saw that we were either getting rained on or we were trying to avoid rain by either getting to the shelter earlier or staying a little bit late. It just rained so much and we were completely soaked. So the rain is one thing, but the other thing that was a challenge is just the variability of the weather. It could go from one extreme to the other in just a matter of a day. And let me give you an example. Later on in our hike, it was typically 90 degrees with 90% humidity, and that was just brutal going up and down some of those mountains. And there was one day that it was so hot that we had to take multiple long breaks to prevent getting heat exhaustion. So the very next day, we're going up Jay Peak and we get caught in a torrential downpour with freezing cold high winds, and now we're worried about hypothermia. So from one day we're worried about overheating and the next day we're worried about freezing to death. So it's kind of crazy how the temperature fluctuates so much out there. The main thing to keep in mind is be prepared for any type of weather at any time of year. Next challenge is chafing. So anytime your skin gets wet, you're at risk for getting some chafing. And there's two reasons my skin was getting really wet. One was all the rain, and secondly was the humidity was making me sweat a lot. My shirt would get completely soaked, that sweat would drain into my shorts, and next thing you know, my whole body's wet. If you end up getting moisture or wet around your butt or groin area, you're gonna be at high risk for chafing. I remember Early Riser in his video series this summer saying he was at ChafeCon 5 for the chafing level. And you gotta have Glide, and it's too late if you already feel the chafing. So the instant you know you're getting wet, put on the Glide and prevent the chafing from happening in the first place. That's the best way to do it. And if you watch the channel, you know that I'm a big proponent of Glide. I used a ton of Glide on the long trail and it really, really saved me. Elevation is the next challenge I want to talk about. And you don't have to worry about altitude sickness. It doesn't go up that high. It's just a little bit over 4,000 feet, I think, at the highest point. But it's the constant up and down that's the challenge. Over 272-ish miles of the long trail, you've got around 66,000 feet of elevation gain. So we did the trail in 25 days with 2 zeros. So if you do the quick math on that, we're going almost 3,000 feet per day of elevation change. That is a lot of up and down every day. And the earlier part of the trail is a little bit flatter, so it's probably more like 2 or 2,500, meaning the last half of the trail, you're like 3,500 or 4,000 every single day. That is hard on your knees, it's hard on your feet, and it just makes it quite difficult. We were thinking there'd be a couple of flat sections here and there, and there really just weren't that many flat sections on the long trail. It is a lot more difficult going straight uphill because they don't believe in switchbacks on the long trail over the rocks and roots and mud and all that stuff. So be prepared for that elevation. It is pretty tough and you're going to work hard just about every day when you're out there. I want to talk a bit about pace as a challenge as well, because a lot of us have in mind our daily mileage goal that we have, and we're used to walking that many miles a day. But on the long trail, it's so much more difficult than your typical trail. I think you got to take your normal number and back it off by about 30%. For example, I like to hike somewhere between 16 and 20 miles a day. That's my sweet spot. There was not one day on the long trail where I went over 15 miles. not one. Some of that was due to the fact that we couldn't hike very long on some days because of the weather conditions, but for the most part, it was because the trail was so tough. It was just hard and so slow going that you couldn't make the number of miles that you normally would be able to get done. Mileage is kind of a personal thing and it's specific to each person, but if you're somebody who hikes around 12 miles a day, maybe you can only do 8 or 9 on a long trail. If you're a 25 to 30 miler, maybe you can only do 18 to 20 per day on the long trail. Overall, I would say back your typical number off by about 30%, and that'll help get you in the right mindset for what you can expect to do on the long trail. And it'll help you better plan your town stops and resupplies as well. Now to the question I talked about at the first part of the video. Would I hike the long trail again? And the answer is no, I would not hike the long trail again. There are 2 reasons for this. One is the danger factor. It was so treacherous and I fell so many times. I felt like I was very lucky to get out of there without being injured. And I did hear about several other people that had fallen and gotten hurt out on the trail. So that's number one. I'm not in a position where I need to take on that much risk when I'm hiking. And second was the misery factor was too high. And don't get me wrong, I expect to be miserable from time to time when I'm backpacking. If you can't deal with being comfortable, being uncomfortable, then you shouldn't be backpacking in the first place. But it was just too much. There were too many days where it was just awful and the terrain was rough and we weren't having fun. And normally when I get to the end of a backpacking trip, I'm just so sad and I wish there were more days to hike. Not this one. Callan and I were just so glad to be done with this thing and we're like, we are never going back there. So no, I would not do the long trail again. And I hope those of you who completely love the long trail take no offense at my honest opinion here. I am so thankful to the Green Mountain Club and all of the work that they've done to make that trail possible. And there were plenty of great memories on that trail. The people we met, some of the views at the top of the peaks, and the really interesting and unique rock climbs that we got to do, the shelters, the awesome privies that they had out there. Those are memories I'll just never forget and always cherish. So there were some really great times to be had on a long trail. But when I think about what I'm trying to get out of a backpacking experience, there were just too many negatives to outweigh the positives on the long trail. When I think about what I love about backpacking, it's pushing miles, it's seeing lots of views, it's just walking all day and having a great time. And there was just a lot more difficulty and challenges and mud and muck and everything else. And it's just not the trail for me. One thing I was thinking about though is it might have been just the time of year, because maybe if we went in the fall when it was a lot drier and there wasn't as much mud and there wasn't as much rain and the humidity and heat were down, it might have been a completely different experience. So there's that to think about as well. But don't be discouraged from hiking a long trail based on my opinion, because that's just what it is. It's my opinion. If you are somebody who really loves challenges and you want to be pushed to your limit, both physically and mentally, I think the long trail is something that you would thoroughly enjoy. It is a fantastic feeling when you finish it and you get to the end and you know that you stuck it out. So there's always that to look forward to. So don't be discouraged from hiking the long trail based on what I'm telling you. By making this video, I'm hoping to share as much information as possible to help you make a completely informed decision on whether or not to hike the long trail, and that if you do choose to hike it, you can have the best possible trip because you're fully informed and you know what to expect when you get out there. Thanks for watching. As always, if you found any value in this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks, and we'll see you out on the trail.